With a series of discussion meetings on the social history of these revolutions, particularly around the long 60s. This series follows on from the incredibly successful events last year around the centenary of the Russian Revolution and the early years of revolution in Russia. These meetings are focused particularly on the revolutionary events that swept the world in the 1960s, so the general strike in 1968 in France, works in the Cuban Revolution and counter-revolution in Iran, and the upsurge of unofficial strikes in Great Britain as well. The sessions are opened by historians who've studied these movements, or by people who participated in those movements as militants. At each meeting there is going to be a talk of about 30 minutes, and then time for contributions and questions as well. Our emphasis is really on the social histories of these movements, that is how they were experienced by the mass of working people who took part in them. The aim of the meetings is to reach a deeper understanding of revolution as the active participation of millions of people in changing history itself. My name is Estelle Cooch. I'm a secondary teacher in South London, and I'm really delighted this evening to welcome Sue Bruley. Sue Bruley was teaching at the University of Portsmouth until quite recently. She's now a senior research fellow at the University of Portsmouth, and she's going to talk a little bit in her talk on the women's movement of the 1960s and 70s, but particularly about some of the research that she is undertaking at the moment. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sue.
Thanks very much for coming. It's really nice to be here. It's lovely to see so many people interested in the history of the women's movement. I've been studying this for a few years now, and obviously we're just going to, if I can only talk for 30 minutes, and I want to hear everybody else's views as well. Forgive me if I don't cover absolutely everything, and so I'll explain. I've got like 3 main areas that I'm going to concentrate on. So I'm going to read it because otherwise I'll probably get in a mess. So I'll start. Anyway, the UK women's activism from the late 1960s is commonly referred to as the Women's Liberation Movement, WLM. This was a mass movement which changed the face of modern Britain. It was arguably the most important social movement in late 20th century Britain. Now, here I'm recognising that structural change, which I'll explain in a minute, was a significant element in this upsurge of militancy. But what I'm aiming to do here is to foreground the women themselves. It was women's agency, which was the key factor in creating the very important changes in gender relations and women's social and economic changes in women's social, economic and political roles in late 20th century Britain. Now, I suppose here I can do a kind of personal angle in that, because I'm of sufficient age that I like quite a few people here, I've actually witnessed these changes. So for the younger members of the audience, I'm just going to start by reminding people of the kind of the institutional barriers and the what you might call today everyday sexism, the sexist culture of the 1960s, before the movement, the things which we now take for granted. So girls like me who were born in the 50s were brought up to believe that their role in life was to be a mother and homemaker, with any form of employment as secondary. In the 1960s, women on average were earning about half what men were earning, and women's educational and career opportunities were stifled by out-of-date ideas about women's role, which meant the great majority of women were stuck in low-grade, low-status jobs with little prospect of advancement. Most women went to secretarial work, catering, assembly work in factories, etc. Discrimination on grounds of gender was legal. So women were excluded from many occupations. Women could not drive trains, buses, couldn't deliver post, there couldn't be an airline pilot, women were barred from the fire service, and if you look at the top echelons of employment, almost every sector, there were no women at the top. In law, a married woman had the same status as a child, so she could not claim benefit in her own right. Women could not gain credit or take out a mortgage without a male guarantor. blatant sexist imagery was rife, and sexual and domestic violence was not addressed, and lesbians were in the closet as same-sex sexuality was unacceptable in almost all social circles. So that was kind of life in the 1960s, and I'm not going to pretend here that we have all the answers and that everything's wonderful now, but there has been a monumental shift since the 1960s. So we've come a long way, but we've still got a long way to go, I know. So history doesn't stand still, and we've had a developing kind of history of the movement in the late 20th century, and it's been evolving since the 70s, since the late 60s, when the movement. So the work that I've done aims to carry, to contribute to that history and to carry it forward. Now, so I'm not going to just sort of, nitpick over old debates and what have you and controversies. So really, what I'm saying is that this talk is based on really summarising the research that I've done, and it will focus on three key aspects. The origins of the movement, what do we mean when we talk about women's liberation, sort of changing perspectives and what we mean by women's liberation, women's activism, and also shifting the focus from the national to the local. So that's what I plan to do. First thing, the area I want to talk about, I wrote an article about this in Oral History, the journal Oral History. I think it came out in 1917, on the origins of the women's liberation movement. And what that says is that the movement has much deeper origins than the new social movements of the late 1960s. Because we have had this assumption that the women's liberation movement, the WLM, was a direct consequence of the late 60s radicalism, particularly of VSC, the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign, and the student revolts of 1968 and 1969. Radical women students reacted against the deeply sexist culture of the New Left and began to address their own issues. That certainly was a very significant political moment. But that was really just the sort of like tip of the iceberg. The political manifestation, the sort of spark for a movement whose social origins go much deeper and much broader. So here we come back to this point about the structural change in late 20th century Britain. There were a number of changes which made Britain much more conducive to gender change. Sustained economic growth, improved living standards, welfare reforms, created minimum economic safety net for all, expanding educational opportunities. These kind of structural changes were the factors which gave rise to increased expectations among young women of the baby boomer generation, like me. So they raised expectations, and Carol Dyehouse, a historian, has called it, she says, like, women became uppity. We're not talking about when they became, before they became political, women started getting uppity. You only got to look at, the Profumo case with the two women. Just gone out of my head, but the two women who are typical of the way they talked in court, and I won't go into all that now. But they were definitely a new kind of woman around, women with attitude. So they had a new sense of empowerment, and if you look back to World War II, women had enjoyed enhanced status and many more opportunities for more satisfying careers. Leaving home, choosing a different lifestyle. Then in the post-war years, our mothers, we older women, had experienced a retreat into a kind of new femininity, which centred on domesticity and postnatalism. women's role was to go home and have babies. The baby boomer young women growing up in the 50s and 60s witnessed frustrated and depressed mothers whose lives were confined by domesticity, and they decided they wanted a different kind of life. So just a couple of examples. Marie McNay, from my oral history, she grew up in a mining village in the north of England, and as the only girl with 5 brothers, Marie was expected to help her mother, but her brothers were not. She said, "That was my first understanding that something was unfair somehow." So she upped in the mid-60s, she upped from the northeast, came down to London, left her life behind, lived independently, and then became an activist. That was very rare in the 60s, but became more common. Janet Brewer grew up in the southwest. Her mother trained as a nurse, and she became a full-time housewife. Observing her mother's life, Janet said she grew up thinking that. Said of her mother, she grew up thinking that she didn't want to have that kind of life with just a home role. A sense of frustration and resentment can be seen in a number of activist women's descriptions of their lives, and they became depressed, frustrated, but they did encourage their daughters to pursue careers and become independent. My own mother worked all through the war in a munitions factory in London. She worked long hours, and she had a great deal of respect because she was contributing to the war effort, and a great deal of disposable income compared to what she earned before, and opportunities for commercialised leisure. In the post-war years, she had 3 children, little money, and was tied to the home except for low-paid cleaning jobs. So she also felt a sense of frustration at her enforced domesticity, etc. So I think from that little section then you can see that I feel there are lots of underlying reasons. It wasn't just about women who were in the student movement who were saying, "Oh, I've had enough of this," etc. There's a lot more to it. So if we move on then to the second factor, which is about the nature of women's activism. So here I want to suggest that if we focus too much on groups which were self-identified and calling themselves women's liberation, we risk missing out on really important aspects of women's activism that was happening in this time. So I think we need to broaden our perspective and look on women's activism as something which embraced a lot of what working class women were doing at the time, and a lot of what women who are involved in community activism, in industrial activism, as well as what has been traditionally described as feminism or women's liberation. Now, what's very relevant to this is that in the late 1960s and from the late 60s to the late 70s, there was an outburst of women's militancy in factories, working class women's militancy. I mean, everybody knows about the Ford strike of 1968, the Dagenham dispute where the women were claiming equivalence with the male rate. But there are lots of other disputes. General Electric was Britain's largest private employer in the 60s. The GEC women in Coventry came out and had a successful equal pay strike in 1973. Trico windscreen wipers in Brentford, they came out because they were fed up with low pay and wanted parity with the men. Because some of the men had been removed from the night shift to the day shift and they were still paying the higher rate, so the women went out on strike. And they figured, well, we've got this equal pay strike now, Equal Pay Act 1975, well, we'll go out and get equal pay. And after 23 weeks, the management, 21 weeks, the management gave in and they got equal pay with the men on the day shift. So all of these disputes then, there are lots of disputes that resulted in substantial gains. Women were really exerting industrial muscle, but these women did not call themselves feminist or consider themselves part of the WLM. So what I think we need to do is to look at the movement in a slightly different way and say, well, this second wave of feminism did actually involve a lot of working class women, and let's not talk about just women who call themselves feminists. On top of that, there is a lot of, there was of course a lot of inward migration, Afro-Caribbean women and later Asian women, and many of these women were working class and were employed in industry. Yorkshire Clothing was enormous numbers of women Asian women went into clothing industry around London. That whole industrial belt around the west of London, there were many, many women working in sweatshops because there were a lot of firms supplying catering or doing cleaning for Heathrow Airport. A lot of those women were in very exploitative conditions. And there's been a lot of industrial action there which has been overlooked. Grunwick is, of course, remember, the photo processing plant in North London, which was on where the strike was from 1976 to 1978. Sadly, the women lost the Grunwick dispute, as there were other disputes in the late 70s which were lost. And that was largely due to the downturn in the economy and the rise of mass unemployment, reducing the potency of the labour movement. But I think we have to look at something really important that's going on at this time, which was it began to sink in just how much the working class had changed. In the 1971 census, women aged 20 to 64 constituted 52% of the workforce. So for the first time in the 1970s, women were a majority of the workforce. So the old model of the white male working class breadwinning militant leading the class struggle has to be drastically revised. So instead we have figures like Jacobi and Desai, you know, because when we're talking about working class women, we're talking about a lot of women of colour here, you know, who I think we can't talk about working class or race, you know, they're intimately linked, aren't they? So, you know, Mrs. Desai was standing against economic injustice, racism and sexism. Minority women were also involved in community activism. They fought against racism in housing and jobs and other issues. These women had a different agenda than white women because black community activists did not identify themselves as feminists or always forefront women's issues, but my argument would be that in taking a leading role in their communities, they were learning valuable organising skills and that they were providing role models of working class women activists. It could be argued that many of these black women activists were combining class, race and gender activism well before the term intersexuality came into use. Right, so that's the end of the second bit. Do you want to go on to the third one? Right, so the third point is the importance of the local. Just to kick off, to remind you then, it was a mass movement. The women's movement was a mass movement from the late 1960s across the whole country and penetrated all social classes. Here we have a poster for the 1971, a march in London in 1971. Between 1970 and 1978, a set of demands was developed at a series of national conferences. Legal and institutional barriers to women, sexist language and social practices were increasingly challenged, and a feminist counterculture emerged. The next one. Sorry, these slides are a bit haphazard, but I didn't get a good range, a representative range, but it's just what I could find quite quickly. Here there's a woman and there's other women there as well. And they're at a tube station and they're selling catcall, and that really sort of cheers you up, saying these feminists in the 1970s, you know, selling a very radical a women's liberation paper on the street, you know, to people passing by. So we've got all kinds of feminist print media going around, not just spare rib. Early historical studies on second wave feminism are focused on the formal aspects of the movement. Conferences, demands, theoretical approaches and campaigns, you know, things like NAC, you know, National Abortion Campaign. But what I feel we've not given enough attention to was the fact that the women's movement was libertarian in character. It had no leaders, no formal organisation, no national structure, only a loose network of local autonomous groups. No democratic centralism, or what is commonly referred to as, certainly then, as vanguardism of the groups that IS, IMG, the groups at the time, were on democratic centralist lines. National conferences only happened if a local group happened to host one. You know, because we don't have, I don't think people understand that there was no national structure. So I argue that by focusing on conferences and the formal aspects of the movement, we're taking a kind of top-down approach when it should be bottom-up. So I think we've had a rather distorted picture of the movement. Too much attention has been given on events such as the first national conference at Ruskin College. I'm not saying it's not important, but you know, why does the media focus on these same things all the time? The Miss World, you know, competition. You know, I was at the Miss World competition, but I just don't think that is the most. That these events should be churned up in the media again and again. You know. So I think it's very important for the kind of cultural history of post-war Britain, the historical memory that we have of post-war Britain, that we include the women's movement. And the media, by being so lazy and focusing just on these events like London, Oxford, have distorted our cultural memory because of this cultural dominance of London. It's meant that northern feminists, you know, have criticised the movement. Perhaps I shouldn't be giving this speech in London, should I? You know, there has been a lot of criticism of northern feminism. There are lots of really interesting things that have been overlooked. So to rectify this, we need to look at local groups, and I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes, you know, talking about the kind of work that's been going on around in the regions. Each city, each area interpreted women's activism in their own way. The movement had no formal apparatus, so it was often very chaotic. The Brighton Women's Centre did not believe in accounting and did not keep check stubs. On the other hand, the Bolton Women's Liberation Group had minutes and elected a chair who was given a set of guidance notes. I can't imagine that happening. Can't imagine that happening very often. Some groups were very academic, reading academic texts like WEA came out of WEA classes or study groups, socialist feminist and radical feminism study groups. On the other hand, you've got groups who appeared at conferences like Bradford Dykes, who tended to drink a lot and were always complaining that there was too much feminist theory at conferences. So, and this would not, this kind of, the kind of heavy Bradford Dykes wouldn't go down very well in Norwich, certainly not in the early years, which was a very conservative area of Norfolk, of course, where the early years of women's liberation were very timid, because they didn't want, the women's group didn't want to alienate local groups like the WI, so they couldn't even mention the word abortion for fear, of the adverse reaction. So they discreetly talked about issues of motherhood, etc. Yeah. In the late 70s, there was increased attention to violence against women. Bradford and Leeds, West Yorkshire, the site of the Sutcliffe Ripper murders, as they were called, gave this whole radical revolutionary feminism much more force. This became a centre of revolutionary feminism. And here we have a group coming out called the Women Against Violence Against Women. So there's this whole load of activity around here, and these histories, these local histories, are beginning to come out now, helped by the next slide is actually a nice reproduction of the Feminist Archive North FAN website, which is housed in the University of Leeds. So these things are being kept, and women are doing research, so more history is being developed all the time. There's another one in Bristol, Feminist Archive South. So by the late 1970s, there were something like 40 women's centres based around British cities. In every major city had a women's centre, at least one. And here I want to just mention the fact that there is a particular issue for how we look at the women's liberation here, or women's activism, because the history as it's been developed is very biographically based. Lots of memoirs that people are looking at. Documents of the self, often called ego documents, autobiographies, memoirs. These are really good for researching things like emotions, but they're not so good for other aspects. So as a result, almost nothing has been written about the history of women's centres, and I just want to draw attention to the fact that these were a really important aspect of the movement, because I mean, we haven't got time to go into it here, but they played this incredibly important role because they gave women a safe space, a place for consciousness raising, pregnancy testing, classes learning new skills, drop-in slots for advice, a place where lesbians could come out, a base for campaigns, much more. So I mean, we need a history of these women's centres. So I want to go on to a couple more points. Just go on to the work. I've lost my bit. I've lost the bit about the. Can you go on to the next one, the banner? Yeah, the project I'm involved with at the moment in Portsmouth, which is funded by the Heritage Lottery Fund. This is just a banner for it, a Barracuda banner for the kind of talks we've done. And here it links in with the point about history of the local, because Portsmouth is a naval town. It was based on the world supremacy of Britain in the 18th century, and from then it was built on naval power, and this is the place where the ships were built and the navy was based. And as I said, a great deal of attention has gone on London, but we do need to develop a broader and more diverse picture. So we're looking at places like Portsmouth because there's a very deep social cultural impact of the Navy, and so we're looking at the city, things like, you know, there's a whole history here of women in Portsmouth who are supporting peace movement, Greenham, CND, who got spat at in the streets because they wouldn't support the Falklands War, things like that. Local women working in Portsea who were fantastically active in housing and succeeded in getting a lot of really good new council housing built. Women who took up domestic violence and successfully established a women's aid refuge and follow-on places women would go to. Challenging sexual violence, setting up a rape crisis centre. So just one example of a local project. So last paragraph, then go back to sisterhood. So I've got to move on order. So I just want to mention finally that there's a whole other element, because if you just focus on conferences and demands and formal things, you miss a whole element of the movement, which is culture of production. Feminist art, literature, theatre, women-only discos, and some cities developed these cultural aspects very strongly, and Bristol is an example of this. And they had this feminist cabaret. These women are wearing a double hat. It's kind of one of the crazy things that the women do, and they called it Sister Show. It was a Sister Show. It was a hilarious feminist production combining songs, poetry, comedy, sketches. It was really outrageous, I'm told. Anyway. In 1973, the National Women's Liberation Conference was held in Bristol. I think it was the Saturday evening event ended with a giant circle of women all dancing naked in a very joyful expression of women's power and collective experience. And there were hundreds and hundreds of women there, but not one single woman told the press about that. It was something that was just internal to the movement. So we need to, if we're going to write an oral history, if we're going to write history of the movement, we need to know about these things. But we only know about them because women's stories have been collected and they're in archives, and women have told us about what happened at these conferences, the more informal things, which I would argue are a really important part of the movement. So what I'm saying is that women's liberation went way beyond specific demands and campaigns. It's also about creating a new life, a new world. Exclusive heterosexual normativity was challenged. Women experimented with collective living. The women's movement meant that women were literally reinventing themselves. And I would argue that we can't just dismiss this as lifestyle politics. These women were consciously and actively striving to create a new and better future. And these informal aspects of the movement were every bit as important as formal meetings and conferences. So I know that probably some of you are going to chuck at me now, the criticisms, and I know that these universalising aspects of the movement were being contested by the late 70s, early 80s, principally by black women, and we can discuss that. So after this period, from the late 70s, there's a new phase, really, isn't there, which we can go on to and discuss. But I think that, we can't deny that, we've got to look at this really fabulous burst of feminist energy from the late 60s to the late 70s and say that women successfully challenged the old model of gender relations in post-war Britain and produced very positive social change. So I'm going to end it there.